Good afternoon, my name is Rob Masson. I'm from the DPO Centre. I'm going to be talking to you about the 5 key reasons why care providers need to appoint themselves a data protection officer. So a very brief show of hands, but are any of you actually a DPO at the moment? You are, good, yeah. And any of you would like to be a DPO, kind of heading that direction? No? Do you work for a care organisation that needs a DPO or doesn't have one at the moment? Or, yeah? No? Clearly not, don't worry. So we'll come back and revisit that one a little bit later. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, I'll tell you a little bit about the DPO Centre and what makes us special and interesting. We're going to talk about why you're going to forget about the GDPR, which sounds like a slightly strange thing to suggest, but all will be explained as we go along. We're going to talk a little bit about the framework and the expectations on you in terms of what the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, expects of you as care providers in terms of the frameworks they need to put in place in order to comply. We'll talk about data protection specifically in the care sector, and then there's those 5 key issues that you need to be considering. So, and then I'll finish off just by talking a little bit about the DPO role and how that might fit in. So, in terms of the DPO Centre, we are a specialist data protection and compliance consultancy. We provide 3 key services within what we do. The first one is consultancy, so it's all about helping organisations to understand their data and the steps that they need to take in order to comply with the regulations. Our core business is actually placing data protection officers into organisations on what we call a fractional basis, so anything from 1 to 8 days per month, and then the amount of time would be dependent upon the size and sophistication of the organisation. The third element is what we call EU representation, so there's a requirement for certain organisations who are normally based outside of the EU to appoint a representative in order to be the point of contact for any data subjects or regulators within the EU. That's unlikely to be relevant to most of you until or unless we have a hard Brexit, and therefore there may be some requirements that you're going to need representation in the EU because we will be outside of it, and therefore that might be something you need to consider in a hard Brexit situation. We work with over 250 clients from all manner of sectors, but medical and health is certainly one of our key areas, and we focus on healthcare providers, medical device manufacturers, and organisations conducting clinical trials. So, slightly flippant comment heading, but forget about the GDPR. And the reason we need to forget about the GDPR is because actually the law in the UK that we need to be following is the Data Protection Act. So the Data Protection Act was renewed or revamped last year when the GDPR came in, and it was the way in which the UK enacted the GDPR into UK law. After Brexit, of course, that's the law that we will be following, and therefore it's the one that we actually need to be more concerned about. Now actually the Data Protection Act is really quite similar to the GDPR in that a lot of the data subject rights and the data controller obligations are essentially identical under the Data Protection Act as they are under GDPR. But there are a few what are called derogations between the two. The main ones predominantly are around the age of a child is considered to be 13 years old under the Data Protection Act, but would be 16 years old. So any of you, if you're involved in child services, that may actually reduce the burden on you in terms of what you need to do. Reanimating anonymous data has become a criminal offence, along with tampering with a data subject access request information. So or an information request or information notice rather that's issued by the ICO. So if you are removing data and deleting it in order to not include it within a data subject access request, then that would be classed as a criminal offence. Interestingly, we also removed the ability for independent organisations to bring complaints. So the likes of Max Schrems in Austria, who's obviously causing a few problems for Facebook and Google at the moment, wouldn't be able to operate in the same way under the Data Protection Act. So it's all for the Information Commissioner's Office to pursue most of the issues that arise outside of or within the Data Protection Act. Now, the Information Commission's Office, as I'm sure you know, is the body that is responsible for data protection in the UK. They're the ones that are enforcing the requirements of GDPR, the Data Protection Act, and various other data protection related requirements. But they actually keep things quite simple. Really, what they want you to do are just three basic things. They need you and want you to be transparent about the data that you process, and that means being kind of open and honest. So the GDPR requires that we tell people about the data that we are collecting, and we give them access to it, and we process it lawfully. So there's various lawful bases upon which we are allowed to generate and collect personal data. And we should have policies and procedures and protocols in place to be able to protect it. And we need documentation and frameworks in place in order to know what we've got and who we're sharing with it, and where it's going. Now, interestingly, the ICO did their annual survey last year, and they found that 34% of us are considered to have trust in the organisations that process our data, which means that 66% of us don't have confidence and trust in those organisations, which is a little bit worrying. But to be fair, that was up from 21% the previous year. Interestingly, only 15% of us are confident that social media companies are processing our data appropriately. So the second area is control, and this is understanding what you've got. So this is things like a data asset register. The first thing is understand what data you've got, because if you don't know what you've got, then it's going to be very difficult to manage it. So you put together a data asset register, which is the foundation for all of the other work that you're going to do in order to be able to control that data and monitor it and make sure that you're doing with it as you would expect. So but within this, it's also things like data sharing agreements and data processing agreements with the people that you share data with and who process data on your behalf. It means putting in place policies and procedures for employees. So that's going to be a privacy policy that you're going to make public on your website, for example. It's going to be a general data protection policy that you use internally that explains to your staff how they should be processing data and your expectations on them. It's going to be employee handbooks, so there's going to be various policies around IT and email usage, handling data sharing requests, breach reporting, whistleblowing, bring your own device, all these things that employees within an organisation need to understand in order to be able to actually control and manage and protect that data accordingly. The third one is then accountability. It's relatively straightforward, but it's the part that is relatively new inside the GDPR and the new Data Protection Act, and that's the requirement that you are accountable for the data that you are in control of or that you process. And that's quite a big step actually from the previous requirements, because now you can't just kind of put up your hands and go, oh, I'm really sorry, we didn't mean to do that, we'll do this from now on. Under the accountability requirements, you have to be able to demonstrate that what you were doing and have been doing and are doing going forwards are all centred around protecting that data and making sure that nothing is put at risk. So in order to be accountable, you're going to need to put together things like your records of processing activities. So under Article 30 of the GDPR, you're required to understand what you're doing, where it is, what it contains, and your lawful basis and how long you keep it for, and all these kind of information in order to be able to, if ever asked, to be able to demonstrate what it is that you do with data. But it's also data protection impact assessments, privacy impact assessments, training logs, risk registers, breach register, all the things that a DPO would use. It's their basic tools that they would be using in order to record what's going on within your organisation, and therefore enable you to be accountable for the information that you process. Now, what was not unusual is that last year, come 25th of May, a lot of organisations did some work in order to ensure that they ticked that box that says we are GDPR compliant. So you'll have got consultants in, you'll have put a project team together, you'll have kicked off a bunch of processes that by the 25th of May last year, you could arguably say that you are complying with the GDPR. The problem is that a lot of those projects were one-off. They were single-step linear processes that got you to a certain point, and on the whole, not a lot has happened ever since. And the problem is that if you're going to build an appropriate framework, then it has to be a cyclical process. It has to be an ongoing cyclical process where you are constantly looking at the information that you've got. You're looking at new systems, new employees coming in. Everything is dynamic within an organisation, and therefore you need to be processing information and looking at what you're storing and how you're processing it on very much on an ongoing basis. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about data protection in the care sector. Bottom line is, due to the service that you provide, you store a lot of what is classed as sensitive data. And that's the data where you have to take special steps, more detailed steps to be able to protect that data. So it's not just normal kind of name and address details, it's things like biometric data, genetic information, health and medical data, sexual orientation, sex life, all of which you're likely to have lots of when caring for the individuals that you do. And therefore, you also, in the process of providing that service, you are also required, and in some cases obliged, to share that information with other people. And so those two things together create quite a lot of risk involved, not only from the type of data that you're storing, but the fact that you're having to move it around quite a lot and share it with other people, and in doing so that increases the risk for that data. So what you must do is be transparent in the way that you process that personal data, and you need to allow patients to get access to it because they have rights to do so. What the GDPR changed is the fact that what it cleared up is the fact that we don't own the data. Okay, we as an individual we do. Yeah, so not the organisations that record it or create it on our behalf. The data belongs to us. The organisations, your organisations, are essentially borrowing that information on behalf of the data subject. Yeah, and you are obliged to protect it on their behalf whilst you use it in order to deliver that particular service. And therefore, based on the assumption that you don't own it, you're just simply borrowing it, it means that we have rights to access it. So, because it's our data, we should be able to see it. We should be able to see what you've got and what you're doing with it. And in certain situations, we have the right to ask for it to be deleted, the right to erasure. Now, there are only certain lawful bases where you can do that, because obviously if you have a legal requirement to record some information, or it's in their vital interest that you keep that information, then of course you can't just delete it because they've requested that you do so, because their life may, in your case, may actually depend upon it, and so on. But we do have the right to rectification. So if we as a data subject notice that something is incorrect, we have the right to request that organisation corrects it within 30 days. Now that can be quite straightforward. If you've got a patient management system and they will need to change their surname because they got married or something like that, that's nice and simple. But the obligation is that you have to involve all of your data processors. So if you hand data over to other organisations who then provide or support you in the service that you provide, you've got to make sure that they have also corrected it. And the reason for that is because you are likely to be what's called the data controller. So you're the organisation that decides upon the means and the purpose of processing. Yeah? And then you will pass that information to a data processor who will perform something on your behalf. Now it may be that there's also a situation of a joint controller. So if you're handing data over to local authorities, the NHS or the actual department, then the government departments, then that would be a kind of joint controller situation. But where you are the controller and you're passing data on, then individuals have the right to obviously rectify that data, and you've got 30 days to go back to them to say, I've corrected it and here's the information you need. You can also restrict processing, so that's where you're using data to perform a service, but you don't want to be, they don't want you to be using it to marketing to them or something like that. So you can remove yourself from a mailing list and so on. And then you've got portability, which we haven't seen a great deal of actually in anything above the very big boys and the banks and the insurance companies. But it is filtering down. It's basically a right that we all have to be able to move our data from one organisation to another. So if you've got a patient that's moving from one care home to another, they have the right to ask for effectively a CSV file or a PDF file, something like that, an electronic readable file of all of their data, so that they can then give it to the next care home in order to provide that, for them to provide that service instead. And so it's kind of reducing the friction involved in moving from service to service, but because it's the data subject's data, not yours, as it were, then they have that right to be able to move that data on. So let's have a look at issue number 1. So first off, of course, you are managing very sensitive data. So that's medical records, care plans, treatment regimes. They all contain sensitive information which you are very much obliged to protect. The easiest way, or step 1 to protecting that data, is probably to encrypt it. When personal information is encrypted, it is no longer personal information because it's just gobbledygook. You can't, if someone looks at a file that contains that information, you can't read it, and therefore it's no longer personal, and therefore, to a degree, it's kind of out of scope of GDPR. So if you are able to encrypt everything, and there are 2 states for encryption. You've got encryption at rest, which is when it's sat on a server in your database, not doing a great deal, but ready to be accessed by somebody. So you can encrypt your servers and the databases that contain that information. And then you have encryption in transit, and this is where you are sending it to someone else over some kind of electronic connection, whether it be kind of direct connection or whether it be something like email. Now clearly you've got things like nhs.net email addresses which are inherently secure as long as they're going to other nhs.net email addresses. If they're not, then I think you've got to put the secure kind of in square brackets in the subject line, and therefore it will arrive at the other end as a link that the person has to go to a website and open an account and basically download that secure email. So email is not a particularly frictionless method of sending patient information for sure. So, but when you encrypt things, you'll be using, in a lot of cases, you'll be using kind of password protection. There are some rules or some guidance around passwords. We tend to recommend that they be, certainly in your case when it's sensitive information, that they be at least 12 characters long, which is really quite long. But they need to contain numbers and letters and ideally extended characters as well. Because every extra character you add in terms of that password makes it exponentially more difficult to crack from a brute force perspective. However, the guidance is also not to change it that often. And the reason for that is because if you're required to change your passwords, especially if they're 12-character passwords, every 3 or even 6 months, you're more than likely to write it down. Or you're more than likely to use something that is very simple to remember or very easy to crack, because every 5 minutes it seems that you're being asked to use, to come up with another password. So actually the guidance is that you shouldn't change it, be required to change it more than annually. Yeah? But even that you're better off using longer passwords that you change less often than you are allowing shorter passwords that you change more often. The data that you're storing, you'll be extracting that information. You'll be producing reports and things like that from it. It may be that you're siphoning data out, putting it into spreadsheets and producing financial reports or whatever it might be as a result. But you need to be very careful that when you extract that information that you don't leave it on insecure devices like your mobile, your tablets, or that kind of, or your home PC, that kind of thing. Make sure that you're kind of storing that on the servers, the work servers that are hopefully encrypted and have got the appropriate security associated with them. And ideally, don't use memory sticks. Don't put sensitive data onto memory sticks if they're unencrypted memory sticks. I know it's very straightforward and very easy. You need to take something home, you need to work on a report or something, and you think, oh, I'll just copy it onto memory stick. And of course, you lose that memory stick along the way, and of course, that sensitive data has been allowed out, and therefore that is going to be classed as a breach, and a reportable breach most likely as well. Believe it or not, you should probably use something more like a OneDrive or a Dropbox, whereby you're uploading information to that Dropbox, which is kind of secure. Then when you get home, you're accessing that Dropbox over a secure connection, and therefore it's an encrypted connection from end to end, and therefore it's generally a more secure way of transferring information out of the building. Now, I've talked a lot about digital records, but of course, as care homes, you will be producing a lot of paper records as well, and therefore you need to make sure that the shredders that you're using are of a certain standard, and that standard is the DIN 66399 standard at level 3 for basic information and level 4 for your sensitive information. So it's the cross-cut ones, the ones that chip it into very small, kind of a couple of millimeters by 15 millimeter kind of chips, and therefore it is classed as being disposed of securely. If you do use a third-party organisation and they come around in the van and they kind of empty your bins and do all the shredding there, just make sure you get a certificate of destruction because your DPO or whoever's responsible for that will need to record that as part of your accountability requirements going forward. So, personal data at the point of care. Now, obviously, we are generating, in the course of your normal daily tasks, you will be creating, you'll be recording personal data as a result of those tasks. So, but we cannot escape the fact that 80% of data breaches occur because of human error, and so a lot of what we do as human beings are the cause. It's not necessarily a technical solution. It's not an IT issue necessarily. But we all click the wrong buttons. We all get duped by phishing emails and social engineering scams and things like that. We leave our PCs logged in when we walk away and go off to lunch. We share our logins with others because it's convenient to do so. We use simple passwords. We send data to the wrong address and email address, all these kind of things. The list goes on and on and on. So we generally are the problem, and therefore ensuring that you've been provided with appropriate training, you have the right policies in place, you have the right IT limitations on the mistakes that we're able to make. That's where you'll be demonstrating your accountability, and you'll be carrying out what are called proportionate technical and organisational measures in order to be able to reduce the effects of a data breach. So, as I mentioned, a lot of what you do, a lot of the data that you collect will need to be shared with other organisations, and quite rightly too, because obviously you'll be passing it on to a whole list of organisations that include other healthcare professionals, nursing organisations, staffing agencies, medical device manufacturers, if you're using anything that's taking photos of various eyes and whatever it might be part of, software vendors, transportation providers, IT support providers, solicitors, website hosting providers, voluntary organisation, charities. All of these are all part of what you do on a daily basis with the data that you're collecting for perfectly reasonable reasons, but because you are the data controller, you are the ones that have the responsibility for that data. And under the Data Protection Act and the GDPR, you're now required to make sure that anybody you pass it on to is also going to be taking proportionate organisational technical steps to protect that particular data. And if they don't, ultimately you're still on the line. Okay? But you need to put in place what's called a data processing agreement. So it's an agreement, a written agreement between you and the people you pass data on to, setting out your expectations on them as to how they are going to process the data that you're responsible for. And of course, we've got this big issue of fines that that the GDPR is bringing, all those lovely fines that we've heard so much about over the last year or so. If it's demonstrated that the processor was entirely at fault, then you can pass those penalties down to the processor. Yeah. But it's obviously quite difficult to prove that fault, and therefore you need to make sure that the agreement covers those kind of situations and where the responsibility lies and who's responsible for those liabilities that occur as a result. So, understandably, the focus tends to be on your patient data. But a lot of you are quite significant employers, and therefore you actually generate a lot of data internally in terms of HR and occupational health and finance and payroll and pensions data, all of those departments and so on are collecting personal information that is internal to you, to which you are also the data controller of, because again you are very much responsible for that information. So it's really important that that doesn't get forgotten. I know that the emphasis is probably on the patient care side, and that's, you know, to a degree that's correct. But a lot of organisations tend to forget their own internal processes, almost at the expense of protecting the patient care data. And you've got your marketing departments. If any of you are kind of for a charity, or you have fundraising departments or marketing departments, then there's another regulation called the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, which you are going to need to be aware of, because that's the regulation that is dictating what you can do with data from a marketing perspective. So the GDPR is responsible for the storage and processing of data. The PECA is responsible for the use of that data for marketing. Okay, so GDPR does not stop you creating data and processing it for the purposes of marketing, but it's PECA that puts the restrictions on how you can, what you can do with it and how you can use it. So that's the one that your marketing department most certainly needs to be aware of, and it's the regulation that differentiates between marketing to another business and marketing to a consumer. And there are far greater responsibilities and restrictions when you are marketing to a consumer, which from a fundraising department is exactly what you're going to be doing quite a lot of. There is a new regulation called the e-privacy regulation that we are expecting to see at some point next year, which is essentially upgrading PECA to GDPR standards. So all of the fines and things like that will be moving up. And there are some quite fundamental changes which I haven't got time to go into today, but it's worth having a look at as to what's coming up. So there's some big changes in terms of consent and so on as part of that. Those of you that have websites, I would absolutely recommend that you now are using a secure certificate. So when you go to your website, you get the kind of green bar or blue bar at the top that basically says secure. Google Chrome made a recent change, so it now says not secure if you're not using a secure certificate, and therefore it gives the wrong impression to visitors, especially in the kind of environment that you want to demonstrate that you do take data protection seriously, and therefore for the sake of, so I think it's about £40 a year, something like that, it's worth installing a secure certificate to your website just to make sure that you are just covering that one off. You may also, by putting a secure certificate onto your website, it means that you're also able to receive contact requests in a secure manner. So when you go to your website and you fill in a contact, or your customer does, they might be putting information about them or a parent or something into that and it might contain sensitive Article 9, which is the sensitive data, into that information, because they might be describing what their mother is suffering from or whatever it is, and therefore that is the data that you are specifically required to protect. Now, if your website is not secure, what it means is that that information is going to be sent over the public network to somebody's inbox. Yeah, it's just going to arrive as an email. And of course, you've allowed that information to travel over the internet in an insecure manner. So if you use a secure certificate, what you can do is you can save the content of that form to your website, and then you just get an email that says you've had a contact, and therefore you log into the website and you view that contact form in the secure back end of your website. So, the slightly more complex one, I guess, is the interaction with other regulations. So, I'm talking mainly about GDPR, but of course, you've also got the likes of the NHS DSP toolkit to contend with. You've got the 7 principles of call-to guardianship, which 6 of which are complementary. The 7th one potentially isn't, because it says basically you have a duty to share information, can be as important as the duty to protect patient data. So it's almost contradictory in itself against something like the GDPR. So you have to be able to kind of navigate all of these requirements and principles as a result. And then we've got the key lines of inquiry from the CQC, which I imagine most of you are probably reasonably fearful of in terms of what are requirements. And the CQC is now bringing in specific data protection related key lines of inquiry or elements of it into their assessment. So I can give you the detail. If you see me after, I can give you the specifics that they're looking for, and therefore things that you might want to put into place as a result. But the important thing is that these principles are generally complementary. So they are there to encourage you to put the right culture in place, to make sure that your organisation just thinks in the right way and does the right things generally, rather than necessarily specifically the letter of one particular law. And so, but you will find most of those are complementary, and therefore, as long as you are instilling a culture of data protection with the organisation, you are generally going to be moving in the right direction in terms of complying with all the many and varied principles that are being that are required of you. So, just to finish off, so why is the DPO role so vital? Many of you will be required by law to appoint a data protection officer. There is still this question over what is large scale. So you are processing sensitive data, but are you processing it on a large scale? Nobody has quite yet, there isn't a case law yet to completely define that, but those of you that are dealing with a lot of beds, a lot of patients, then it is likely that you are going to fall into that trap. But it's not necessarily a kind of a clear line between when you must and when you don't need to. There is a benefit to having somebody within your organisation that understands data protection and knows how to navigate all of these different issues that are coming up. And so they need to be there to monitor that compliance. They need to be looking at anything new that occurs within the organisation, new staff coming on board that need training, new systems that are coming in place that need to have impact assessments carried out on them. And you need somebody who is going to be monitoring breaches and recording information relating to it from an accountability perspective. Because whether you need a DPO or not, you are still accountable for your data. Yeah? So it doesn't matter what size of organisation you are, you still have to demonstrate that you take data protection very seriously. There's also the issue of conflict of interest. So if you are a DPO in your organisation, but you are a senior manager or a director, then it's likely that if the ICO ever came and asked some questions, came knocking on the door, then they're likely to look at a director role, especially because you've got a fiduciary duty to develop the organisation. You are kind of not there to represent the needs of data subjects, yeah, so the people you store data on. And so the two roles essentially conflict with each other, and that's why the regulation states that you're not really supposed to do that. And therefore, the obvious answer, I know I would say this, but the obvious answer is that you outsource it, because you can involve a third party who has the necessary knowledge and experience, but isn't necessarily affected by the conflict of interests issues. For those of you that said that you don't have a DPO, then clearly, hopefully by now you would realise that you probably do need to have one. And for those of you that are a DPO and now realise that you probably shouldn't be, then another reason to come and talk to us. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and thank you.